Chapter 21, 11th day of June, 1680. Neither being fresh to the King's Bench, nor any longer holding admiration for the process inside the building, I was not in awe of the ancient law court on the south side of the river at the Southwark. Had it not been a trial for my life, I might, however, have delighted in the journey from the prison, sat on the open cart in the hot midsummer sunshine. I might have enjoyed every bump in the road that jolted me and reminded me I was alive after so much stillness. As it was, though the whole time I prayed to the Lord for strength, by the time we arrived outside the courthouse, I was stuffed full of panic and dread for what awaited me beyond the crowd. As wolves drawn by the smell of blood, they awaited my arrival with anticipation of my conviction and death. They would not so happily await my salvation. Nor, if history were to give an account of now, would the court do any but hang the life from me. With my hands tied behind my back, the prison guards pulled me in a rough fashion from the back of the cart and ushered me inside through the hostile crowd. Neither encouraging me against the taunts nor protecting me from grabbing hands, they pulled at my clothes as if they would remove them. Indeed, some person took my hat and destroyed it, and then pulled my hair until it hurt. Someone spat in my face, then another did the same. With my hands still tied behind me, I could not wipe the wet away and must endure it sliding down my face. Once I was past the crowd, still grabbed at and taunted, the rope around my wrists were removed, and I quickly wiped my wet cheek. It did not wipe away the humiliation and degradation that I would have to carry with me for many years. I thought on my hands being free now, and looked to see if there were any escape. The crowd had tightened the circle around the edges of the room, removing any chance of making a run for it, even if I were brave enough to try. None would allow me escape and deny them that entertainment. And where could I go? There was no place I could go. They would not find me. I was pushed behind a rail in the middle of the room, where those being tried are made to stand, with the judges to the front and the jury to the left. The room was spacious enough that I did not feel bound tight by the walls as I had in the gatehouse. Spikes of sunlight shimmered with motes of dust through the windows and landed on the faces and periwigs of the judges and on the crowd of onlookers, both seated and standing, giving a false sense of hope. The sunlight uplifted the spirit in a way that belied the smell of the sweat and dung I could only imagine came from the misbegotten worms that accused me that, though I had not yet seen them, must be close by. As when I stood in the busy court little more than a year ago for the trial of the Jesuit priests that were condemned that very day, people fanned themselves with any manner of thing against the summer heat. I shivered as echoes of the priests' voices passed through me. Such reasoned voices asked only to be heard fairly, but they were not. I looked over to where Dangerfield had waited on the witnesses from St. Omer with such poise and composure when he had looked so debonair. And then he had attended to me and made me flush with his gallantry. Where he stood then was a different place to where he stood this day. Now he stood, falsely and traitorously, against me, and would be the death of me, for none had yet survived the lies of false witnesses. He may yet consider himself my executioner. I grabbed hold of the wooden rail supports and I stood behind. My fingers poked into sticky cobwebs hanging between the posts, and I imagined the spider hanging somewhere out of sight, just as somewhere nearby a spider watched how I was caught in this courtroom web, waiting for me to tangle myself in its lies until I could not escape. And tangle myself I would, for this spider was an expert at catching flies and not letting them go. I noticed other breeze-blown, dust-covered grey threads dangling unreachable from the high ceiling, and in any corner of the room a broom would not fit. Is it not strange that my thoughts set themselves on a thing so small and insignificant, when those very insects that trapped me there would soon suck my life out of me? But everything was both sharp and clear at the same time, as if it were happening not to me but to another. Mine was one more trial, but after I had gone and died, there would be others that I would never know about. I withdrew my hand from the cobweb and moved it along the rail until I found a good support. The polished woodwork was everywhere smudged by mucky palms or dirty overcoats, and I quickly withdrew my hands when I touched a place that was rough, dried like bark. I did not like to think what filth had left their mark there, though that the place I had spent the last month was as bad, if not much worse. It occurred to me, if I was not so put upon, I might have remarked upon the absurdity of such foolish thoughts. This was a veritable palace compared to the prison room I had so recently come from. 277 days, all counted, I had suffered in that place, and I was more than happy to see any other room, even if for so short a time as it would take to convict and hang me. There was no use in holding on to hope, but even if hope had left me, I must still do everything to prove my innocence, no matter if I lived or died. Only I stood between life and assured death, for only I was allowed to defend myself. I clasped in my hand several important pieces of paper, and in my head as many rules of the law as it could hold. I must put up a fight for my life with everything I had, and I was as ready as I could ever be, for I had many months to prepare. A lump in my throat refused to move and let me swallow. Without thinking, I put my hand to my neck and found my crucifix. I must pray. I imagined my eyes closed, though they stayed open, and I prayed to God for my salvation. Give me strength and wit, O Lord, to find a way of proving myself, I prayed. If it was my time to be taken, then I would accept it gladly, for I did not fear death, only leaving life. I did not wish to leave my children and husband to tend themselves when two were too young and one was too old. I did not remove the cross from its concealed place beneath my dress for fear of drawing attention to it. Instead, I rested my hand over where it lay on my chest, fast rising and falling with every agitated breath, and drew strength from it through the fabric. Many faiths wore the cross, but on this day, the very wearing of it might bring prejudice against me. A man might be charged with treason for standing against the king by following a different faith, and they say, raising the Pope above him. In truth, this was what was meant by treason in this age, and had been so for many years, since the question of the king's successor had arisen. Charles had no true heir, but his Catholic brother. The people of the kingdom rather chose a government of strangers with the right religion than the rightful king of the wrong religion. Forsooth, I must remain vigilant, I reminded myself. My hazard was a real one. I was to be tried for plotting against the king on the word of perhaps a single man, not for my religion, though that is what it has come to, but for treason. I must keep my eye on the target of acquittal and shoot arrows at Dangerfield's unworthy testimony. Hassled witnesses and persons of the law pressed against unknown persons looking for a good show. Catholic haters shone like lanterns in the night, hungry anticipation on their faces for a hanging. They had me guilty before my proof was heard. One less foreigner, they would be thinking. I hoped to disappoint them. As was the custom, every person, whether sinner or sinned against, bowed their head or stood silent as the judges entered the room. Clothes whispered and feet shuffled as the fortunate few that had seats, the jurors, whilst the judges took possession of their own reserved area. Only wooden bars separated the seating areas for the judges and the jury, and the standing areas for the witnesses and the spectators. Once the judges had sat, they either talked quietly amongst themselves or took a good look around the court to see who was in attendance. one peering at the lords and ladies through an eyeglass on a stick and nodding to one or other of them when his inspection was returned. Many quenched their thirst with beer or wine, or spilt it as they jostled against each other. My fear was not allayed by the sight of one judge. Presiding over the court sat the one known to me from earlier interrogations, the judge that condemned many an innocent man based on false evidence of the Oates cohort, the judge that sent men to the gallows on the testimony of rogues, the judge that killed priests with such proof that they would have been thrown out of court if it were held against any Protestant, Lord Chief Justice Sir William Scroggs. I would receive neither sympathy nor fairness from him. I would be disposed of shortly after all. "Swear in the jury," he said with vigour, without more than a brief glance at me. I do not believe he saw me at all. The 12 men of the jury stood to swear the oath. I recognised 2 of them from previous juries, and remembering my hours of learning, immediately spoke up. "I asked for that one to be accepted," I pointed at the man I had seen before, "and that one too." "For what reason, Mrs. Cellier?" said the recorder. "There must be a reason." "They were at another trial, and that might give them prejudice," I said. "I ask for any that have sat on other trials to also be accepted." A few minutes later, the 2 men that were the only ones to admit to sitting on previous trials were replaced by 2 others. I did not know any of the other men, and could not see any reason why they might not be as good or bad as any other, and so the jury was set. The law was a powerful tool, I surmised, if you knew anything of it. More important, it seemed a person did not have to be a man of the law to use it. But if I had been pleased that I had used the law to my ends, my triumph was short-lived minnow. When the court's clerk read out the indictment against me, buried in his own thorny observations, he was neither an admirer of mine, nor was he partial to me in any way. I was disallowed to answer the opening speech. He took advantage of this to convict me before even a single witness was called. His predisposition to suppose those tried for treason must be guilty could not be more clearly tangled in his brambled words. "Here stands Elizabeth Cellier, wife of Peter Cellier, late of the parish of St. Clement Danes in the county of Middlesex. She stands accused of plotting against our most illustrious and excellent prince, King Charles II. False faith prevents her eyes from seeing the Almighty God and allows her to be seduced by the devil and to forget her allegiance to her natural lord and king. Instead, she involves herself in dastardly plans to disturb the peace and tranquillity of this kingdom." And he went on. "On the 1st day of November 1679, the 31st year of the good king's reign, at her home in St. Clement's Dane, and with other yet unknown traitors, Elizabeth Cellier devilishly, advisedly, maliciously, cunningly, and traitorously consulted and plotted to depose the king with force and arms, and to deprive the said king of his crown by his death and final destruction. And furthermore, not satisfied with such terrible imaginings, she has wickedly schemed with all her might to destroy the true religion of this land and to introduce the superstitious worship of the Church of Rome into this kingdom, to traitorously stir up a war against the king of this land, and to subversively overturn the ancient government of this realm." The man rather revealed his own prejudice than mine, and I was sorely tempted to interrupt and defend myself, but it could hardly have helped my case. "How say you, Elizabeth Cellier? Art thou guilty of the charges of treason whereof thou stand indicted, or not guilty?" "Not guilty," I said. "How wilt thou be tried?" he said. "By God and my country. My voice rose to the occasion and reached every person there. May God send thee a good deliverance. My husband's friend that I had known 10 years or more, the astrologer John Gadbury, was sworn in as the first witness. He was brought here to testify against me and knew enough that he alone might send me to the gallows. Gadbury was a peculiar man, so often lost in his heavenly world and rarely anchored entirely in our own. When he did not have his eye to the planets in the heavens, he was buried deep in the almanacs he wrote, and was, I believed, as eccentric as he told me the planets were. However, he was a sincere and honest man, and I did hope he would be conscious of the oath he had sworn in the eyes of God, so would be obliged to tell the truth. Hope, the sweetest of seducers, gave me confidence in the face of doubt. I had stood comfortably well with Gadbury before I was in Newgate, and before he was also imprisoned. It was a recent discovery that Dangerfield had not only turned against me November last, but also Lady Powys, Lord Castlemaine, and Gadbury. When I was questioned about him, I was bound to tell the truth, and though I did not say a thing but what I knew, they twisted my testimony against him. The examiners counted only words that came against him, none in his defence. Scroggs came to his feet and moved to the front of the court. He was coarse and loud-mouthed. His prejudice against prisoners tried for any part of the so-called Popish plot was infamous, but unexpected diligence in some trials gave me to anticipate he might not be wholly without intelligence or fair spirit, though I might be mistaken in that. In the last days of April, I wrote to him to clarify whether I would be tried under common law or upon a statute, and if so, what statute. I further asked for a copy of Dangerfield's pardon in order to defend myself. The statute I was to be indicted under, Scroggs wrote back, allowed me as many subpoenas as I wished. He did not know about the said pardon, he continued, but told me to petition the Lord Chancellor for it, which I did, and received it some time afterwards. Given his evident distaste for Catholics, I was surprised he took the time to give me such a complete answer. Mr. Gadbury, what do you know concerning this plot? Asked Scroggs now, coming straight to the point, his mouth twisting contemptuously. If Gadbury did not say something to condemn me, Scroggs would openly belittle him, but if he said anything in my favour, he would dismiss it derisively, as was Scroggs' way. Gadbury fidgeted guiltily, his eyes darting around the room as if he were hiding something, although, to my knowledge, he had no guilty part to play in anything. He straightway denied any knowledge, as I hoped he would. I know nothing of it, neither one way nor another, he said. Do you know of any contrivance of Mrs. Cellier to kill the king and change the government? No, rather the contrary. Gadbury was uncommonly quick to talk, not even pausing to think. I will tell your lordship what I know, if these gentlemen will not be too nimble for me. I have suffered a great deal of prejudice of late in relation to a plot, as if I knew of one, but as God is my witness, I know of none, unless it were a plot to bring Sir Robert Peyton over to the king's interest. Oh no, he must not talk about that. How senseless it was to do so. It had nothing to do with my case, and would needlessly bring in a man that need not be there. That was the only plot I know about, Gadbury added. But Mrs. Cellier was supporting the king, not against him. She could not have acted both for and against the king at the same time. Scroggs would not be grateful for Gadbury's championing of me. For that loyalty, his testimony would most certainly be discarded. Mr. Gadbury, you are a man of learning, Scroggs scolded. Please say only what you know about Mrs. Cellier, not your beliefs. Though not a man of wit, Gadbury was a man of intelligence. Dangerfield's betrayal embraced him as tightly as it had me, but it was me his eyes now accused. I had not purposely said anything to incriminate him, but his next words placed the business fairly on my shoulders. He told Scroggs, "While I lay in the awful gatehouse at the prison, believing my life was in danger, Mrs. Cellier was a witness against me, so I have no reason to speak for her." Silent, his eyes tested the truth of it. If I had betrayed him, every other person in the court looked to Gadbury, so none but he saw me barely shake my head. I was uncertain he saw my denial until he turned back to Scroggs with new boldness in his face. He could have told some false things, but he told fairly. "If I believed there to be a treasonable plot, I would have discovered something about it." I gave him silent thanks. Still he spoke. "Mr. Smith, my old acquaintance of mine, came to me for some important advice in his affairs regarding the lords in the Tower. He told me he knew of something against Mr. Oates, and wanted to know if he should use it to make Mr. Oates withdraw his evidence. I told him he should not. Then, when I met Mrs. Cellier later, she told me Mr. Smith and another man named Phillips had some stories about Mr. Oates and Mr. Bedloe they wanted to tell. I told her how Smith had come to me to ask if he should speak out, and she said she did not mind paying me 10 guineas if he would be honest and tell the truth." Gadbury's story was true account of events of the day. I had asked him if we could trust Willoughby. I was only sorry he offered it so freely. Scroggs jumped in then. "So, that was after you did advise Mr. Smith not to meddle against Mr. Oates?" Damn his nimbleness. He would twist the astrology round until the poor man did not know what he was saying. Indeed, Gadbury's face was pure perplexion. "Yes, my lord. She said that Mr. Dangerfield, we then knew as Captain Willoughby, talked of how the plot against the king they called the Popish plot was a deception plotted by nonconformists to incriminate those of the Romish religion." "Did she say that Dangerfield said there was a nonconformist plot, and that he hoped the Popish plot would continue? Or did she say she herself hoped the Popish plot would continue, as he did in other trials I had seen?" Scroggs seemed to refer to something told to him at another time, not in the court, perhaps when they had quizzed Gadbury after indicting him. "My lord, I cannot remember particulars," said Gadbury. "There's a great deal of difference between Dangerfield saying it and her saying it," parried Scroggs. "I have no reason to spare her. She did me the greatest injury in the world," said Gadbury, looking to me then with reproach in his eyes that I hope was for the court's sake. "But I am unwilling to say a thing contrary to the truth." Scroggs turned his attention to the plot against the Catholics. "Why were you talking of a nonconformist plot?" "It was common talk in the coffee houses," Justice Raymond interjected. "What makes you think it was common talk? Did you hear someone talking about it before she said it?" "No, not until she spoke of it." Then Scroggs took back the questioning. "So you do not know that Mrs. Cellier did not invent the plot? Did she tell you of any Popish priests or Jesuits come over from beyond the seas?" "She said she heard there were some coming over." "Why were they coming over?" "God knows, I do not." "Did she speak of a plot to kill the king?" "No," said Gadbury. "She reviled plots, otherwise I would not have kept her company." "Nicely said, my friend." "Again, I ask you, did she say several priests and Jesuits were coming over, or that she had heard this?" "My lord, I think she said she had heard it, and several times when I said to her that the Popish plotters would be destroyed, She said she was afraid the nation would be destroyed first. Again, nicely done, Gadbury, but not quite so honest as I recollected. I had truthfully said the Popish plot had scared many a good man and woman to leave the country in fear of their lives, and it would destroy the nation. By the oath you have taken, did she say she was afraid the nation would be destroyed first, or that it would be? It is important you did answer carefully. I clearly remember she said she was afraid the nation would be destroyed, for she said too many of our nation's best went abroad to live and spend their money, and that weakened and destroyed our own nation. And what did you and Mrs. Cellier talk about as you walked through Westminster Abbey? The change in tack threw Gadbury for a moment, as it was supposed to do. Since Gadbury had not mentioned our walk in the court, it could only have been talked about ere this day. He frowned in deep thought. My lord, my memory has been exceedingly bruised by time, but I do remember it was a rainy afternoon, and as we admired the architecture, Madame Cellier commented on how the abbey was formerly filled with Benedict monks, or some similar thing. She asked, what if it should be so again? What is your faith? Are you a Protestant or a Papist? It was a question Scroggs already knew the answer to. A Protestant, my lord, said Gadbury. He would not have been given grace to swear on the Bible had it not been so. Scroggs turned to the court and he said, he talks like a Papist. Then, without turning back to Gadbury, asked, was it perhaps, what if it should be filled? I barely recognised the difference between what Gadbury had said and what Scroggs did. Would that Gadbury could. Gadbury looked to the roof in thought and repeated, she said, what if it should be so again? And what did you say to that? Gadbury smiled for the first time, as if sharing a joke with his fellow men in the court. I only smiled to hear a woman's talk, my lord. Many men of the court laughed with him. Surprisingly, Scroggs also smiled. The effect was so to put me down, as I believe he intended. It might not hurt my case if the jury saw me as a simple woman, but my pride had me stand taller and glare at them all. Men on different sides of the battle would find more in common than with a woman on the same side, so often did they stick together. Still smiling, Scroggs continued. You make all the company laugh, but let us return to serious business. What did she say about the temple? Again, the leap in subject to me, to one not mentioned today, was further indication Scroggs asked questions from previous knowledge of the matter. She said the temple had been filled with friars. Did she also talk of filling it again? She said only that the abbey was once filled with Benedictine monks, and the temple with friars. That is all. But what else did she say concerning the temple? Scroggs chewed on it like a horse on a bit. He would not, or could not, let it go, even though it was of no consequence that I could see. Nothing, my lord. What else did she say? Remember where you are, and that you are testifying in the presence of God Almighty. Tell it plainly, make no more of it than it was, nor stifle it. Really, said Gadbury, it was only small talk, nothing more, only as I've said. Another of the King's Bench, a judge that identified himself as Sir Thomas Jones of Shrewsbury, told Gadbury to read what he had written on the paper he held in his hand, to remind himself what he had told them before, which Gadbury did. I feared the old judge's severe interpretation of the law belonged at the turn of this century, from a time of our present king's father's father, King James, and it was common knowledge that Edward Coleman, secretary to the Duchess of York, and one of Mr. Titus Oates' first victims more than a year ago, was found guilty by this man's strong conviction against him. Did she say she hoped to see the temple filled with Benedictines? Asked Justice Jones, grimacing as he scratched at some crawling creatures beneath his extravagant wig. My lord, I do not remember that word hope. For one standing on trial for my life and like to lose it, that word hope was the only one the Lord had given me that was of any use to me these days. What else did I have? How long have you known Mrs. Cellier? This was Scroggs again. Gadbury looked at me as if my face had all our meetings written on it. 10, or perhaps a dozen years. Did she ever question you about the king? Gadbury's eyes shifted to Scroggs and back to me again, perhaps giving him the appearance of guilt. My lord, she questioned me when the king was so ill at Windsor, and everyone feared he would die. What did she ask? Said Scroggs, immediately interested. Like others, she wanted to know whether I thought His Majesty would live or die. She feared he would die. Did she expect you to know it from your art? Scroggs turned to the common people of the court and raised his eyebrows. They tittered obediently. Yes, my lord. She is one of many that come to me for such answers. And what did you tell her? I never answer questions about my sovereign, my lord. I told her I would not meddle with this. How else would Gadbury answer this question when it was against the law of the land to even imagine the king dying? Did she desire you to give a reading after you said you would not meddle with it? No, my lord. She only asked that question. Obviously, seeing this line of questions was leading nowhere, Justice Raymond interrupted. What else did she ask? What did they desire him to say? My lord, when she realized I would not answer that question, she said to me, I see you are afraid of me. I will go to some other astrologer. Perhaps she asked if he would live or die for evil intentions. It is your duty to God and your king to declare if she said any more about the king dying than you have told us. She was fearful he would die? Why did she say she would go to another astrologer? To his credit, with eyebrows raised, Gadbury's voice held a certain amount of scorn, as if it were a ridiculous question. To satisfy her curiosity, as great many do, and because I refuse to meddle with the death of the king. Surely she would have been better to go to one of the clerks than to a conjurer for answers. I tried not to smile when Gadbury's mouth gaped open. Did you answer any other of her curiosities? It took Gadbury a little time to recover his composure. He smacked his lips together while he gathered his wits about him. She sometimes asked me whether a person would be prosperous in the world or similar, and I would answer such thing. But I am shy of meddling with anything that might be to do with a plot. She did ask how she would get Mr. Dangerfield out of prison, and, my lord, she did ask about some deeds or papers which Dangerfield was to search for or seize, which concerned Mr. Bedloe. Did Gadbury know it sounded as if the question I asked might be to do with the plot? You were not shy answering about these things? I did not know for whom I did the reading at the time. It is only since that I discovered it to be for Mr. Dangerfield, then calling himself Willoughby. What? How is it possible to do a reading for a body if you do not know who they are? As a teacher talking to a child, Gadbury explained. My lord, Madame Cellier gave me the time of a person's nativity, and I set the figures of the heavens to that sign, to know whether the person could be trusted to collect money for her husband, a French merchant. So you mean to say this might have equally been a reading for a woman? What was the answer? I cannot remember, my lord. Very convenient that you forget. When did you know the reading was for Dangerfield? I did not know his name until I stood before the court today, my lord, and as I said, he called himself Willoughby at the time. Abruptly, as if he were bored with him, Scroggs finished questioning Gadbury and turned his back. Call another witness. Whether Gadbury was relieved or affronted by his perfunctory dismissal was hard to see, since he quickly turned away and walked towards the back of the court with his head held as an arrowhead on a back straight as a shaft. My curiosity as to whom would be next called was quickly satisfied. My bosom friend Dangerfield was sworn in. Immediately, Attorney General Sir Creswell Levins spoke from beneath his long grey periwig curls. Don't be a mouse now, Dangerfield. Tell us everything you know about this woman. Levins' shapely feminine mouth and pink cheeks contradicted his masculine Roman nose and square cleft chin, and unlike the court clerk and Judge Scroggs, revealed little of it, whether he was for or against me. I returned full attention back to the two-faced scoundrel that bore such a resemblance to the man I knew as Willoughby when he began to speak. If Dangerfield had no compunction about sullying me with his lies, I had made a weapon to defend myself against them from all he had himself foolishly gifted me while he stayed with us. Then I had feared his bragging tongue might be our undoing, but now I intended using that very same puffing of feathers to besmirch him and save my neck. I only hoped I had gathered enough skills to use such information as he did so freely give of his past to discount him as a witness. It had not been the easiest task to discover proofs of his every wrongdoing, but in my hand I clasped papers of all the felonies and misdemeanours he had been charged with in this country alone. I could only hope that not all of these were covered by the pardon he so freely given him by His Majesty the King. Some considered that a felon with a pardon was not a felon at all, and that Dangerfield should be considered as innocent as if he had never committed the crime. I did not. The advice given me by a priest in jail might not steer me true, and my hand may yet fail. But if I must die, I would not die without casting doubt upon Dangerfield's testimony. If I must die, I would do all I could to take him with me. Before he could say more than a few words, I spoke with a strong voice. My lord, I have an exception against that witness. Why so? You must show some reason, and then we will do you justice in God's name, said Scroggs bored. If I can prove he was whipped and transported, pilloried, perjured, etc., then he cannot be a witness. When last he stood against me, he threatened some of my witnesses that if they would not swear as he would have them, he would kill them, I said. Trust in his word must be based on lies of quicksand. Scroggs ignored all but what interested him. He was well known for not listening to, nor remembering, most evidence against any Catholic that came before him. It was also known he decided a prisoner's guilt and had them executed in his mind even before the trial began. So his next uncharacteristic words gave me reason to pause, to consider what motive might be driving him. If you can prove he is convicted of anything that can by law take away his testimony, then do it. His eyes did not waver from mine. I did take the chance before it could be withdrawn. I straightway started with the simple crimes. He has been convicted for burglary, I said. Scroggs turned to Dangerfield and asked him outright, Were you convicted for burglary? She will have to prove I was, said Dangerfield. How silly to ask him. Of course he would not admit to it. I asked for Dangerfield's friend, Ralph Briscoe, who stood nearby to be sworn in. I did not presume he would be much assistance, but hoped he would at least confirm he knew Dangerfield. Once sworn, Scroggs asked him, "Do you know this man?" Though Briscoe knew Dangerfield well, he talked as though this was a long time ago. I noticed he did not meet Dangerfield's eyes. "I remember one Thomas Dangerfield. I saw him burnt in the hand at the Old Bailey." "Is this the same man?" "I do believe 'tis the same man, but I have not seen him for some years." "He lies," I shouted. All he had to do was show Dangerfield was convicted of a crime he had not been pardoned for, but Scroggs was not convinced Briscoe knew him well enough, and dismissed him. Neither did he hear me. "So, that is no proof, then. Everybody has a right to a fair trial. Do you have any more witnesses?" That he asked showed how he did not know my character. I had done my research. "My lord, he was convicted for perjury." "Do you have records to prove he was convicted?" No, I had to admit I had failed to find any paper proof of this, though I knew it to be true. Others in earlier trials had tried and failed to discredit Dangerfield in this way. "Then you cannot prove it," finished Scroggs, circling his eyes to the roof, then round to the crowd. He pursed his lips into a sneer. "My lord, I can prove him guilty of forgery." Dangerfield had bragged over and again that he excelled in this art, and by writing to the many places Dangerfield had been, I had found evidence of this. "You can only prove it if you have written record of it." The recorder, whom I recognised as young Judge Jeffreys, spoke then to the other judges. "What she means is counterfeiting guineas, not what the law calls forgery," he said, showing his knowledge of Dangerfield's reputation was not nothing. Scroggs nodded at the judge and continued. "Can you show me he forged any deeds? If you can prove he is a committed forger, but he is not convicted, that is of no use." I nodded at this and handed him over a leaf of paper I had held tight to me under my cloak. Scroggs looked at it briefly, then asked Dangerfield, "Do you have your pardon? She has proved the conviction of felony, so now prove you have a pardon for it." I could not resist adding, "I have the copies of several records of his convictions here in the court, which will be sworn to. He does not have a pardon for all of them." "I have my pardon," he said. I admit to more than a little satisfaction upon seeing him squirm like the worm he was. My papers would prove beyond doubt, even with his pardon, he was still an outlaw. He was instructed to fetch his pardon so it could be examined, and being yet a free man, he disappeared out the door. I suspected that was the last any of us would see of him. Dangerfield was the only true witness against me, but unfortunately Judge Jeffreys did not want to twiddle his thumbs waiting for his return, and ordered other witnesses should be called in the meantime. They called a man Thomas Williamson, who aided me in my charitable release of prisoners from Newgate, and who had asked me to free Dangerfield when I knew him as Willoughby. When he was sworn in and said who he was, they asked him why I was so kind to Dangerfield. God only knew I regretted my kindness now. To Williamson's, "My lord, I know that not." Justice asked what I wished to do with him when I had Justice asked what I wished to do with him when I had him out of the prison. I knew his aim in this. He, as many others, would rather I was a loose woman. Indeed, I had played on that when it was necessary to do so, so I hoped that particular snake would not come back and bite me. Williamson had nothing to say, but Judge Jeffreys said, "He is here as a witness that she had a great kindness for Dangerfield." "Well, that would set him up as an unhelpful witness for them, then." Then they swore in my old maid Margaret, who I fired a year ago for that she had opened her mouth time too often when she slandered me to my own daughter. Margaret Jenkins, what conversation did you hear between Dangerfield and Cellier? Said Scroggs. Margaret said, I only saw them together twice. 'Tis a year since I came from them. Scroggs obviously knew the two occasions she talked about, because he forgot to ask her what they were and went straight into asking about them without giving the court the same benefit. When you saw them at dinner or supper together, who else was present? Her husband was with her one time. And what did they talk about? They talked about the condemned prisoners. Was this at their house? Her house? No, sir, at my Lady Paris' house. This was all straight, but I wondered what she would say about the other times, in fact, she saw us together. She had been with us when we did release Dangerfield from the prison, and when she bought his suit from the pawn shop. She did as well see him in my room after his bath. She could stir up trouble for me. Why were you there? I carried messages for her, said Margaret. And did you ever hear her talk about the plot? No. I expected her to add more about Dangerfield and me, but she did not. And that was that. I silently thanked Margaret that she had carried herself with conviction. Without asking about any other time she had seen Dangerfield and myself together, Scroggs next called on my maid, Susan Edwards. Margaret looked at me as she left the stand, and I had a soft moment for her then. She had been loyal until the day I dismissed her. She had not done wrong by me this day, when she could have made things worse for me. Perhaps I could forgive her now. After Susan was sworn, Judge Jeffreys leapt in before Scroggs had a chance to. What do you know of any intimacy between Dangerfield and Mrs. Cellier? Scroggs looked at the judge, obviously surprised at the interruption, and added, Did you ever see them together? Susan said, Yes, very often, my lord. She said it outright, that the Popish plot would turn to a Presbyterian plot. And there it was, my betrayer. She may hold no love for me, being a Presbyterian herself, but I had thought she would have some honour and loyalty. My hopes were held too high. Duplicity came from the least expected places. Scroggs asked if I had said that to Dangerfield, and Susan said no, but that it would not surprise her. She said that Dangerfield had declared to her he had to turn rogue and discover all their Catholic plots. What did you say to that? Scroggs asked curiously. I said he would be no greater rogue than he was before. You were pretty nimble with him, said the Lord Chief Justice, showing teeth yellowed by ale. He thought he should be hanged. Susan must have been closer to Dangerfield than I had thought. What for? He thought he was on the wrong side, and if he did not turn rogue, he would be hanged. Then she turned to me, and to my chagrin said in front of the whole court, You were very often together in your chamber. I could have slapped that satisfied smile off her vindictive face. How good we had been to her, how ungrateful she was when we had given her every comfort. We had paid her well, she had broken bread with us. I had even given her leave to choose clothes from my wardrobe when I no longer had use for them. Who gave you your clothes? I said. She ignored my rejoinder and continued to the court. One morning, when her husband was at church, Dangerfield was with Mrs. Cellier in her chamber. What's your purpose in saying this? Scroggs scrutinised her, as well he should. Even he could see vindictiveness made her say that, but though it did not look good for me, it was no worse than it had been splashed about the coffee house this last year, according to young Bowden at the prison, who had bartered the kindness of the bread he had from me with snippets from the city. Young Judge Jeffreys again intervened. Susan is a civil young woman, meaning, I suppose, her word should be believed. I put my life in danger for her, and she said to mind my own business when I told her that she should watch what she did, said Susan. Ungrateful wretch. How convenient that she forgot how much I had done for her. She was dismissed from the stand, and with the certainty from our employ, and my groom, Bennet Dowdall, was sworn in. What would they have him say? As it happened, he said only he had seen Dangerfield together with me, and that we had tried to make a match between himself and my friend Mrs. Mary Airy, that I visited in Newgate with, but he had never heard us talk about any plot or the king. Scroggs asked Judge Jeffreys if there were any more witnesses, and was told we would have to wait until Dangerfield returned with the pardon. He then asked me, "Do you have any record to show Dangerfield was put in the pillory?" "Yes, my lord." I handed over the record from Salisbury that I had treasured this last month, and he read out how Dangerfield had been pilloried for counterfeiting guineas there. I also handed over a record to show he was an outlaw for a felon he was still wanted for in Salisbury, and Scroggs also read that to the court. "What say you to this outlawry?" Scroggs asked the judge. "'Tis not the same person." How could the judge possibly know that? Was he in the pay of the Whigs? Nay, that must not be possible. How could one trust the law that was in the hands of one side and not another? With Scroggs' next words, I relaxed somewhat, for though his reputation was for being partial to the side of the Protestants, his next musings were most surprising. "We should be careful we get this right, or it will be a sad day for the country if we stood back and allowed a person who has been immoral and corrupt his whole life before he came to Newgate to be responsible for taking away a woman's life. Persons of his character are employed to discover the way of things, but when they give us the answer we seek, 'tis hard to believe them. He has been gone so long, one might wonder whether he has taken a boat to France." Scroggs then said to Captain Richardson, the gaoler of Newgate, "Is this Dangerfield the same that broke Chelmsford gaol?" "Yes, my lord, I believe it is." "He is so convincing he would have me believe he might fly," said Scroggs. "We will not be hoodwinked by such a fellow guilty of so notorious crimes. Having been in the pillory, if he had been at all modest, he would not look another man in the face. It appears from the record that not only was he burned in the hand for theft, but he was then outlawed for felony." Scroggs sounded surprised, as if he had had no inkling what a scoundrel Dangerfield was. Yet I had heard it by the subject of many a polite and impolite debate within prison, and so it must have been so in society. Still we waited for Dangerfield's return. I studied the people of the court as they studied me. Soon some folks talked amongst themselves, and some stood in silence. I found the face of my beloved husband, Pierre, as one such. He stood still and quiet in the middle of the second row, an old man amongst the rowdy rabble. Around him men fidgeted and talked either coarsely or quietly with their neighbours, but, face tense, his eyes drank me in like rain after a drought, or a cup of mulled sack after a long day, or as though it was the last he would ever see my face. My case rested upon proving Dangerfield a dishonourable and untrustworthy witness, and Pierre had proved himself useful in aiding me, collecting evidence from divers towns fallen down in Dangerfield's trail. But it was easier for them to punish and convict me than not to do so. My life was already too long for most every person there. I could not bear to see Pierre's pained face. He was right. To die for truth was a noble thing, but to leave him and the children was another, one that, in the light of that same truth, I had not truly considered until now. My actions were without heed for my family, when family was all I could trust. What had I done? We had to wait a further half-hour before Dangerfield returned, holding his papers high. For him to come back, he must have believed none of it would stick on him. Scroggs took the paper from him, then read the pardon to the court. It was in Latin, so most would not understand. He emphasised the relevant part where it said the pardon was for omnia maleficia et utiligaria colia or damage due to outlawry, which Scroggs interpreted as being between two parties instead of the words which would apply to the outlawry of felonies. Simple as that, they ruled that Dangerfield was still an outlaw for felonies, and that his evidence would be laid aside. For a moment I touched the fabric of the dress that sat upon the cross around my neck, and gave thanks to the Almighty God. He had been kind to me this day, but I must stay vigilant, for all was not over, and Scroggs had not yet finished with Dangerfield. He walked right up to the wretch, and stood as close as decorum would allow, then took one more step. You, sir, must know we are not afraid of such fellows as you. I would like to shake you, and all like you, for your villainies. Chastised by the judge, Dangerfield did not wince at this, but took on the double appearance of a humble man, whilst looking Scroggs straight in the eye, as a bold one, in the manner he had with the king. My lord, this is enough to discourage a man from becoming honest. That was a mistake on his part. Scroggs' face, so close to Dangerfield's that their noses touched at the tips, became red and his eyes wide. He slammed his hand hard on the bar in front of Dangerfield so that the scoundrel jumped back, and I nearly laughed. What? How dare you? Who are so notorious a villain and full of mischief of hell? How dare you be so impudent? Justice Jones also slapped down his hands on the bench where he sat, and his loud growl said it all. Indeed, if this is the man so named, he is certainly not fit as a witness. That he is the same man appears to be notorious. Come, Mrs. Cellier, what have you more to say? Scroggs' invitation to add to their outrage was welcome, but to be circumspect was prudent in the face of the judge's wrath. Enough, my lord. I let them decide if the case was proved or not, on what had been spoken, and if we were finished here. Scroggs wiped the spittle from his lips as he returned to his seat, and Dangerfield wiped his face. Yes, you have said enough already. You need not prove more. Come, gentlemen of the jury, this is a plain case. Here is but one witness in the case of treason, where there should be two, and this one is not believable. Therefore, lay your heads together. He did not ask them to leave and make their decision, as they should have. He would have them make it there and then. They found me not guilty, as they should have done. I silently cheered that it was the task of that horrid clerk of the Crown who did open the case with so many barbs to bid me to get down on my knees, which I did. He could not prevent his mouth pouting as he swallowed his gall and cried, God bless the King and the Duke of York, with which words I was released from captivity and had my freedom. Though I could now leave, I stopped still as Scroggs raised his voice. Where is Dangerfield? Where has that villain gone? Call him back at once. Some men at the back shouted that he was there, and Dangerfield was compelled forward by hand after hand of the various persons along the aisle. Someone should be punished for today's work, and if it was not to be me, then Dangerfield was a perfect fit for the task. Do you have bail for your good behaviour? No, my lord, but with a leave of court I will fetch some. Let a tipstaff go with him, and return before the court rises. Dangerfield, on the point of leaving, said, My lord, that cannot be, for I cannot return so soon. With a smug tightening of the lips, as though he suspected, nay, desired this would be the case, Scroggs slapped his hands together and boomed, Then let him be committed. Dangerfield's face, as he was led from the court, was a picture I happily stored for bringing back many a time when it would lift my spirits. I smiled. A more satisfying outcome I could not have imagined. Before leaving, I was instructed I must give each man a guinea should the jury find me innocent. I had not come prepared to win, and did not have 12 guineas. I knew from listening to talk in previous trials these men often came many miles from the city and gave their services for only a small meal, as well as whatsoever they were given by the innocent prisoner. My fortune was twofold, for I had also heard that juries for treason trials were given a deal more from the king for finding a prisoner guilty than finding him innocent. These men had passed over decent payment in order to find me not guilty, and now I had no benefit to offer them. On impulse, I thanked the spokesman kindly for his wisdom and said, Please accept this offer of my most humble service to you and all the worthy gentlemen of your panel. If you please, I will serve your ladies in their deliveries with no less fidelity than you have done me with justice in mine. This price was worth a good deal to any woman that was with child, but of course, though it was freely and sincerely offered, they could not accept this gift of good value, since they were all of them Protestants and could not be served by a Catholic midwife. I left a jury denied fair payment for their good judgment this day, and joined my dear Pierre. He took my hands and led me quickly from the court to murmurs of how I had run rings around the judges and could teach them a thing or two. The moment we reached a place it would be decent to do so, Pierre pulled me close in his arms and kissed me sweetly, and as at length, after a good while, he stopped and smiled. The first you must do, my dearest Lizzie, is to take a bath, he said, for though you are the sweetest treasure God could send, I would prefer it if you smelt a deal sweeter still. He had no words back from me. I was done arguing my case for the day.